Robert Gray never thought a cracked piece of asphalt could become a battlefield, yet as he stood at the edge of his old parking lot, the air around him felt heavier than the August heat. The lot had belonged to his family for decades, a leftover patch of commercial land surrounded by carefully manicured homes that had long ago fallen under the jurisdiction of the local homeowners association. His father had used it as a small mechanic's yard, fixing engines and repainting old trucks, the kind of modest business that anchored a neighborhood before everything was replaced with coffee shops and dog spas. When his father died, the tools were sold, the shed was torn down, and the property stood quiet, forgotten, like a relic surrounded by perfection. For 3 years, Robert paid the taxes and kept the place clean, trimming the weeds himself, unsure of what to do with it. Then, one spring morning, he decided to bring it back to life. Not as a business this time, but as a place for others, a weekend art market where local craftsmen, painters, and food vendors could gather, where neighbors could talk to each other instead of just waving from behind tinted SUV windows. The first Saturday was better than he could have imagined. Families walked between the tents, someone played guitar near the old oak tree, and the scent of roasted coffee drifted over the asphalt. Even the older residents, the ones who never smiled, paused to look around. Robert felt something stir inside him, a sense that the land finally had a purpose again. It was more than nostalgia. It was a pulse, a reminder that a piece of this sterile neighborhood could still breathe. When the sun went down, he helped the last vendor pack up and stood there for a long time, watching the string lights fade in the dusk. For the first time since his father's funeral, he felt peace. That peace lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th morning, a silver sedan pulled up while Robert was repainting one of the faded parking lines. The woman who stepped out wore a linen blazer despite the heat and carried a yellow folder tucked neatly under her arm. She introduced herself as Carolyn Weaver, president of the Willow Bend Homeowners Association. Her tone was polite, almost rehearsed, the kind that carried a warning beneath every syllable. She informed Robert that the association had received multiple concerns about the market: parking congestion, unauthorized commercial activity, and noise violations. Robert wiped his hands on his jeans and told her calmly that the property wasn't part of the association's residential zone. It was commercial, privately owned, and had been for over 40 years. Carolyn smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said she would review that claim. By the following week, a sign appeared at the entrance of the lot. Community zone, temporary closure pending review. Someone had even placed orange cones across the driveway during the night. Robert tore them away and stacked them against the fence, trying not to let the anger boil over. He wasn't a man who liked conflict. He'd always believed that most problems could be solved with patience and common sense. But there was something about Carolyn's certainty, the bureaucratic precision in her words, that left a sour taste in his mouth. She spoke as if she already owned the ground beneath his feet. That evening, Robert walked the perimeter of the lot, tracing the old boundary markers his father had once shown him. The metal stakes were still there, half buried under soil and roots, exactly where they'd always been. He followed them one by one, past the fence line, past the storm drain that marked the end of his parcel, until he reached the cracked curb where the residential street began. The difference was clear, undeniable, yet for reasons he couldn't quite name, he felt uneasy. He knew from his father's stories that the HOA had always wanted this land, the only commercial strip left untouched by their beautification projects. Maybe this was just another push. Maybe they thought he was too small to fight back. When he finally turned off the lights in his truck and looked once more at the lot, he realized something had shifted. The space no longer felt like his alone. It felt watched, measured, as if unseen eyes were already calculating its worth. And for the first time in his life, Robert understood what his father had meant when he said, "They don't take your land with bulldozers anymore. They take it with paper." The first real sign that something was wrong came not from Carolyn or any official notice, but from the quiet. The following weekend, when Robert arrived early to set up the art market, the lot was empty. The vendors who had promised to come simply didn't show. The coffee stand, the jewelry tent, even the man with the hand-carved birdhouses, all gone. Only one woman, a local ceramic artist, was there, standing beside her van with an apologetic look. She told him she'd received a message the night before from someone claiming to represent the HOA, warning that any unauthorized commercial use of the space would result in fines and towing. She wasn't sure if it was true, but the others had decided not to risk it. Robert tried to brush it off as intimidation, but a strange unease crawled up his spine. That night, when he returned home, an envelope was waiting in his mailbox. It wasn't official stationery, just a blank envelope with his name typed neatly in black ink. Inside was a printed notice titled, "Notice of Shared Access Violation." The letter stated that the parking lot had been designated as a community easement for resident overflow parking, and that continued private use violated revised neighborhood boundaries ratified in 2019. At the bottom was Carolyn's signature, perfectly looped and confident. Robert read the letter 3 times. There had been no public vote, no notice, no hearing. He drove to city records the next morning and requested the zoning maps himself. The clerk, an older man with thick glasses, scrolled through the digital registry and frowned. According to the most recent update, the line separating Robert's lot from the HOA's residential section had indeed been redrawn. A sliver of land, barely 8 feet wide, extended into his property, enough to classify it as a shared access zone. Robert asked when this change had occurred. The man checked the file date, 6 months ago. "But that's impossible," Robert said, leaning closer to the monitor. There was no hearing, no notification. This was never residential. The clerk shrugged, clearly used to dealing with this kind of quiet corruption. "Sometimes these adjustments slip through when no one contests them," he said. "If no one objects in 30 days, the change stands." Driving home, Robert's thoughts raced. He had been paying taxes on this land every year, maintaining it, repairing cracks at his own expense. And now, through some bureaucratic sleight of hand, it was suddenly shared. He parked his truck by the curb and walked the boundary again, tracing the same metal stakes as before. The markers hadn't moved. Yet according to the documents, the map said otherwise. That night, under the dim light of his porch, he spread out every piece of paperwork he could find. The deed, tax receipts, a photocopy of the original purchase his father had made in 1981. Everything matched, except for the new city record. The precision of it infuriated him. Whoever had orchestrated this knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't a mistake. It was a quiet theft. 2 days later, a crew appeared without warning. They wore bright orange vests and parked a small utility truck by the curb. Robert watched from his window as they unloaded a roll of temporary fencing and bright plastic signs reading, "Future Community Improvement Area." He walked outside, demanding to know who sent them. One of the workers, young and clearly uncomfortable, told him they had a permit from the HOA to install safety barriers. When Robert pressed for documentation, they hesitated. "You can talk to Mrs. Weaver," one of them finally said, lowering his eyes. "She said to tell you this is temporary." Robert called her immediately, but she didn't answer. Within an hour, the fence was up, sectioning off half of his parking lot as if it no longer belonged to him. By sunset, 2 police officers arrived. They claimed they'd received a report about a property dispute and potential interference with authorized work. Robert explained calmly that this was his land, that the men had no city-issued permit, but the officers seemed hesitant to get involved. "Sir, this sounds like a civil matter," one of them said. "You might want to take it up with your local association." Robert almost laughed. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "The association isn't local to me. They're trying to make it theirs." The officers left, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch watching the faint glow of the construction tape ripple in the breeze, feeling a mixture of disbelief and fury. He kept thinking about his father's old warnings, how the HOA had tried, years ago, to buy the lot for a token price, claiming it would increase community value. His father had refused, telling them that community didn't need a gate or a fence to be real. Now it felt as if they were settling that old score through Robert. The following morning, he visited the county zoning office again, this time demanding to see the approval record for the boundary change. After a long wait, a clerk handed him a copy. The document was stamped, dated, and signed by a notary whose name Robert didn't recognize. Beneath it, in smaller print, was a line stating, "Petition initiated by Willow Bend HOA, submitted on behalf of the adjacent property owner, R. Gray, deceased." His father's name. The breath caught in his throat. His father had been dead for 7 years. Whoever had filed that petition had done so under a falsified signature. When he confronted Carolyn later that day, she didn't even flinch. She was trimming the hedges outside her house, perfectly composed, as if she'd been expecting him. "I assume you've seen the documents," she said calmly. "It's a simple misunderstanding. There was a clerical mix-up about ownership after your father passed." Robert stared at her, stunned by her composure. "A clerical mix-up doesn't forge a signature," he said through his teeth. Carolyn smiled faintly, still focused on the hedge trimmer. "Mr. Gray, you're making this far more dramatic than it needs to be. These things happen. The association simply wants to ensure consistency in property use. You have nothing to worry about, as long as you cooperate." Robert stood there, speechless, as the hum of the trimmer drowned out the pounding of his pulse. For a long moment he didn't move. Something about the way she said cooperate chilled him. There was no threat in her tone, yet every instinct told him it was one. That night, when he drove past the lot again, the fence gleamed in the headlights like a cage. The market lights were gone, the asphalt stripped bare, and for the first time since he'd inherited the land, he felt the terrifying weight of ownership, the kind that could be taken from you not by force, but by a signature you never wrote. The following week began with the smell of fresh tar and the mechanical hum of machinery that didn't belong to him. Robert awoke to the sound of a cement mixer echoing across the street, its low rumble carrying through the morning haze. When he looked outside, he saw men in reflective vests marking new lines across the edge of his parking lot. They were painting bright white borders, cutting directly across the asphalt that he had resurfaced himself 2 summers ago. A small sign had been hammered into the ground overnight. "Community parking, temporary construction zone." It was as if the association had decided, unilaterally and without hesitation, that the land was theirs. Robert stormed out, his voice steady but sharp, demanding to see a work order. The foreman barely looked up. "We're subcontracted through a neighborhood maintenance program," he said, his tone deliberately neutral. When Robert asked who authorized it, the man simply pointed to the logo on the side of the truck, Willow Bend HOA Maintenance Division, and went back to his clipboard. By the end of the day, half of the lot had been covered in a new layer of sealant, and wheel stops had been installed at regular intervals, transforming his private property into what looked like a public parking space. The absurdity of it left Robert speechless. He called the city inspector's office, but the woman who answered told him the permit request had been logged as routine maintenance. When he pressed for more details, she hesitated before lowering her voice. "Mr. Gray, this isn't the first time they've done something like this," she said quietly. "If they filed it as maintenance, we can't intervene without a formal complaint. You'd need to file a property interference claim." Robert thanked her, though his voice was trembling by the end. He didn't have the resources or the time to navigate an endless maze of forms and hearings. What he needed was proof, something irrefutable that showed the association had crossed a legal line. That night, he returned to the lot after dark, headlights off, letting the truck roll silently to a stop. The air smelled of fresh paint and wet asphalt. He crouched near the new concrete borders and noticed something odd. Beneath the surface of the newly poured curb was a set of embedded metal stakes, positioned exactly where his boundary markers had been. The HOA hadn't just paved over his lot. They had deliberately buried the physical evidence of his ownership. When he brushed away the loose gravel, he found one of the original stakes bent and forced into the ground, as if someone had tried to erase it. He pocketed the piece, his fingers trembling. This wasn't carelessness. It was surgical. Someone had planned every detail. 2 days later, he received a formal letter from the HOA's legal office, written in the same bureaucratic tone he had come to despise. It accused him of obstructing authorized improvement works and warned that further interference would result in financial penalties and potential legal action. It ended with a line that made his stomach turn. Failure to comply may result in reassessment of property boundaries. They were threatening him with the very thing they'd already manipulated, a quiet reminder that they held the bureaucratic weapons to finish what they'd started. Robert sat at his kitchen table for hours that night, the letter open in front of him, the edges of the paper curling under his grip. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew injustice when he saw it. The HOA's power didn't come from law or logic. It came from exhaustion. They won because people gave up, because fighting them meant spending months in hearings and filing appeals while your life unraveled. The next morning, Robert met with a local attorney named Lydia Chen, a calm, deliberate woman who specialized in property disputes. She listened intently as he laid out the situation, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she tapped her pen against the desk. "You're not dealing with incompetence here," she said finally. "You're dealing with intent. They're manufacturing a paper trail to justify their control. We'll need to move fast before they record anything else." She filed an emergency injunction request to freeze any further boundary modifications and contacted the county recorder to obtain the digital submission logs. Within 48 hours, they discovered something unsettling. Several documents tied to Robert's property had been accessed and edited through a private municipal account linked to WB Compliance. The initials, Lydia explained, matched Willow Bend's contracted zoning consultant. It was all starting to align. Someone inside the system had quietly collaborated with the association to rewrite the map. That discovery should have given him relief, but instead, it filled him with dread. He began noticing small, deliberate acts of interference in his daily life. Flyers accusing him of unauthorized use of residential property appeared on his truck windshield. Clients who had expressed interest in using the lot for events suddenly backed out, citing legal complications. Someone even placed an anonymous online review claiming his father's old business had been responsible for environmental violations decades earlier. A transparent smear, yet effective enough to stir gossip among neighbors. The quiet respect he once felt from them had turned into sidelong glances and curt nods. It wasn't open hostility, but something colder. Doubt. Late one night, after another fruitless call to city zoning, Robert sat outside on the hood of his truck, staring at the empty lot bathed in streetlight. The silence pressed against him like a weight. He thought about the absurdity of it. How a small piece of land could become a weapon. How paper and ink could erase an entire legacy. The worst part wasn't losing ground. It was watching the truth dissolve behind the language of policy adjustments and community harmony. He realized that the HOA wasn't just stealing his property. They were rewriting the story of it, one bureaucratic line at a time. And then, as if to punctuate the thought, a car slowed in front of the lot. The driver's window rolled down, and for a brief moment, Robert saw the unmistakable silhouette of Carolyn Weaver, her face half lit by the dashboard glow. She didn't stop or speak. She just looked at the fence, at him, then drove off, her headlights fading into the night. It was a quiet, deliberate gesture, but the message was unmistakable. The battle was no longer about property. It was personal now. For nearly a month, Robert lived in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and unanswered messages. Lydia was doing what she could, but the legal system moved slower than the destruction happening in real time. The lot he once considered an open canvas had become a battlefield layered with fresh asphalt, new signage, and the constant hum of machinery that no longer belonged to him. Every week brought another letter, another accusation, obstruction, unauthorized use, harassment of workers, each one stamped and worded with mechanical indifference, as if a machine were writing them. Robert tried to keep up, but even his attorney began warning him that without an official ruling, the HOA's actions would continue unchecked. He started documenting everything, taking careful notes on the dates of each incursion, the names on the trucks, even the license plates of visiting contractors. The more he recorded, the more patterns emerged. Every city-approved project tied back to the same subcontractor, a company called Greenstone Urban Renewal, whose mailing address turned out to be a P.O. box registered by the HOA itself. It wasn't just manipulation, it was a shell operation. One late afternoon, when the sun hung low enough to paint everything in amber, Robert drove to the municipal records office for the third time in as many weeks. The clerk recognized him instantly and didn't bother hiding her sympathy. She pulled the file he requested, the permit record for Greenstone's activity in Willow Bend, and slid it across the counter. It was thinner than he expected. Most of the forms were blank, signed only by a generic compliance supervisor. At the bottom, however, something caught his eye. The section marked Architectural Authorization was filled out by hand, the signature looping elegantly, followed by the name Carolyn Weaver. His pulse quickened. She hadn't just signed off on her own association's construction work. She had claimed to be the project's architectural consultant. But HOA presidents weren't city contractors, and unless she possessed a license, that signature was illegal. He thanked the clerk, requested a certified copy, and stepped outside into the dry evening air. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the document, the ink glowing faintly under the last of the daylight. Lydia would know how to handle this, but part of him didn't want to wait. He needed to see what else she was hiding. It wasn't anger that pushed him forward. It was curiosity, a cold, methodical drive to understand the shape of the enemy he was fighting. He drove through the neighborhood slowly, past the identical houses with their perfectly trimmed lawns, past the silent rows of mailboxes painted the same color. The uniformity of it all seemed sinister now, as if every neat hedge concealed some small act of deceit. When he reached Carolyn Street, her house stood out, though not in any obvious way. It was immaculate, of course. White siding, black shutters, and a wraparound porch decorated with potted plants. But there was something subtly off about its placement. The driveway curved just slightly into the neighbor's easement, and the corner of her fence extended beyond the property line according to the map Robert had memorized. He parked across the street, waiting for dusk to settle. Lights flickered on inside, one room after another, and for a brief moment he thought he saw her silhouette pass by a window. He couldn't explain the tension tightening in his chest. He wasn't there to spy, but the weight of what he'd found demanded confirmation. When darkness finally fell, he walked toward the edge of her yard, stopping where the public sidewalk met the gravel of her side gate. There was no mailbox marker, no visible house number. The wooden post where it should have been was blank. That detail sent a chill through him. Every registered residence in Willow Bend was required to display its address under HOA ordinance. If her property had no number, how had she received her own permits? The next morning he brought the question to Lydia. She stared at him for a long moment before turning to her computer. 10 minutes later she leaned back, rubbing her temples. "Her house doesn't exist," she said quietly. "Not officially. There's no permit, no zoning record, no utility registration under her name. The land parcel is listed as reserved municipal green space. Unbuilt? Tax exempt." Robert felt a surge of disbelief. "You're telling me the head of the homeowners association built her house on a patch of land that's technically public property?" Lydia nodded slowly. "Or someone let her do it, and no one ever questioned it." The revelation hit him harder than he expected. For weeks he had been treated like a criminal for holding a weekend market, while the very person enforcing the rules had broken every one of them. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it also explained her calm, almost arrogant demeanor. She wasn't afraid because exposure would destroy her, not just politically, but legally. Lydia wanted to go straight to the city's building integrity office, but Robert convinced her to hold off. He wanted to be certain before filing anything. If they moved too early, Carolyn would bury the evidence or shift the blame onto one of her contractors. "We need something irrefutable," he said, "something she can't twist." Over the following week, he began noticing subtle movements around her property. Trucks parked at odd hours, workers entering through the side gate, the faint glow of welding equipment at night. It was as if she had suddenly decided to fortify the place. One afternoon, while pretending to jog through the neighborhood, he caught a glimpse of a man unloading stacks of concrete sheets into her backyard. The sound of drills echoed through the fence. Lydia later speculated that she might be reinforcing the structure to pass as a permitted renovation if inspectors ever came. The entire situation felt surreal. The head of an association illegally modifying her unregistered house while threatening him for repainting a parking space. That Sunday, Robert drove to the county assessor's office unannounced. The clerk there was reluctant to help until Robert showed him the certified copy of the permit Carolyn had signed. After a tense silence, the man pulled up a confidential registry and frowned. "That's interesting," he murmured. "This address, it shouldn't exist. The parcel she's on was never transferred from municipal ownership. It's technically leased land, meant for a drainage buffer. Building a residence there would be a violation of city code." He paused, then looked at Robert with something close to admiration. "If this is what you think it is, she's in very deep trouble." Driving home that evening, Robert felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle over him. The panic and confusion that had defined the past month were replaced by focus. For the first time, he wasn't reacting to what the HOA did. He was holding something they couldn't easily counter. Every injustice he'd endured, every threat, every sleepless night now had a visible face. But beneath that satisfaction was something darker, the quiet certainty that people like Carolyn didn't lose gracefully. He knew there would be consequences. Still, when he parked beside his lot and stepped out into the cooling air, he allowed himself the rare luxury of hope. The fence still cut through the asphalt, the signs still hung like scars, but for the first time, the balance of power had shifted. He didn't sleep that night, not from fear, but from clarity. In the stillness, he mapped out the next steps in his mind. Gather every record, every discrepancy, every piece of evidence showing how far she had gone. It wasn't just about reclaiming the lot anymore. It was about exposing the rot beneath the neighborhood's perfect lawns. Carolyn had built her kingdom on stolen ground, and he intended to bring it all down, inch by inch, until there was nothing left for her to hide behind. The first retaliation came quietly, disguised as coincidence. A week after Robert confirmed that Carolyn's house had no permit, he returned home to find a folded note wedged under his windshield wiper. It bore the HOA's letterhead, though the tone was colder and far more personal than the previous notices. It accused him of initiating false claims and warned that continued dissemination of defamatory information would trigger legal consequences. The irony almost made him laugh. The woman who had forged property lines and falsified municipal records now threatened to sue him for defamation. But laughter quickly gave way to unease. The note was unsigned, and there was no copy in the association's public log, which meant it had been hand-delivered, probably late at night. Someone had walked up his driveway to leave it there. The following morning, Lydia called with news that made the situation worse. The county's legal department had temporarily sealed access to the zoning registry, citing a security review. Without those files, they couldn't present their evidence of Carolyn's illegal construction. Lydia suspected someone inside the HOA had pulled strings to stall the investigation. Robert listened in silence, the phone pressed to his ear, his mind already leaping ahead. The association was moving fast, trying to bury everything before it could surface. By noon, He noticed unfamiliar cars parked across the street. Same make, same color, always changing spots, like placeholders meant to unsettle him. He refused to believe in paranoia, yet the timing felt too precise to ignore. Then came the sabotage. One morning he arrived at the lot to find deep trenches cut across the asphalt. The new curbs had been torn up, the barriers half demolished, as if a small bulldozer had plowed through during the night. Spray-painted words covered the remaining fence panels. Private property, violation. The absurdity was almost poetic. The HOA had vandalized the very site they claimed to be protecting. Robert called the police, but the responding officer treated the incident with weary detachment, writing a few lines in his notepad before suggesting it might have been teenagers. Robert wanted to believe that, but he knew better. The vandalism wasn't random. The trenches cut exactly along the original property boundaries he'd been fighting to restore. Someone had tried to erase the evidence once, and was now ensuring there was nothing left to measure. That night, Lydia came to his house with 2 thick folders and a face that looked older than the week before. She had managed to get a partial data dump from a clerk she trusted, logs showing the HOA's internal communications with the Greenstone subcontractor. The emails were short but revealing. Carolyn had personally approved payments for surface restructuring and boundary integration, both terms referring to his lot. More disturbing was the timestamp on one of the messages, sent at 2:13 a.m., the same night Robert had seen her car idling across from the property. Lydia's voice trembled slightly as she read the next line aloud. Ensure the area is inaccessible before sunrise. Homeowner is escalating. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was strategy, coordinated and deliberate. Robert could have taken the findings to the press, but the idea repelled him. He didn't want spectacle or pity. He wanted justice, clean and surgical. Lydia filed a formal complaint to the City Ethics Committee, but before they could process it, the retaliation deepened. A utility truck arrived one afternoon, and without warning, city workers began disconnecting the electrical lines leading to the lot. Robert confronted them, and one of the men produced a printed order claiming that the property was non-operational. When Robert demanded to see who had authorized it, the man hesitated, glanced at the name, and said quietly, "It came from your association." By nightfall, the lot was in total darkness, the string of old bulbs he'd hung for the market now useless ornaments swaying in the wind. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation. He began receiving anonymous calls, never words, just breathing, static, then a click. On the third night, the calls stopped, replaced by something worse. Silence punctuated by the sound of tires on gravel outside his window. Robert watched from behind the curtain as a shadow moved near the edge of the lot, too deliberate to be random. He turned on the porch light, and whoever it was disappeared into the dark. The following morning, he found a pile of shattered glass near the fence, as though a bottle had been thrown and smashed there. Lydia urged him to report everything, but he refused. There was no proof, and he couldn't bear another officer's indifferent shrug. The final blow came from the city itself. A formal notice arrived in the mail declaring that the parcel was under temporary review due to non-compliance with neighborhood safety ordinances. The wording was bureaucratic, but the implication was brutal. While under review, he couldn't make repairs, file complaints, or remove the fencing. The land had effectively been frozen, neutralized without a single court order. Lydia's frustration was palpable when he called her. "They've boxed us in," she said. "It's procedural warfare. You can't fight what doesn't exist on paper." Robert felt something inside him harden. All the patience, all the attempts at reason had led to this. Isolation, erasure, and quiet threats. But anger sharpened his focus rather than breaking it. If Carolyn thought she could bury him under paperwork and intimidation, she had underestimated the stubbornness that ran through his family like blood. He began to plan differently, moving not through offices or hearings, but through observation. Late at night, He drove through the district, tracing the outlines of other properties managed by the HOA. And what he saw unsettled him deeply. Several lots showed the same anomalies: minor shifts in boundary lines, unregistered construction permits, discrepancies too subtle for most owners to notice. Carolyn's scheme wasn't personal. It was systematic. When he returned home, exhaustion pressed on his shoulders, yet his mind burned with clarity. The fence that divided his lot was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was evidence. The cracks, the trenches, the buried stakes, all of it told a story she couldn't erase. Robert decided then that the next move would not be defensive. He wasn't going to wait for her to make another strike. If she wanted to play games with paper, he would make sure that paper burned. The hearing took place on a gray morning that seemed to carry its own warning. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing against the glass walls of the municipal building as if the weather itself wanted to watch. Robert arrived early, a folder of documents under his arm, his hands steady for the first time in weeks. Lydia had prepared him for the chaos, for the interruptions and evasions that always came with cases like this, but he was past intimidation now. The conference room where the meeting was held looked sterile. A long table, 12 chairs, and a row of city officials already leafing through their copies of the file. Carolyn sat across from him, perfectly composed, wearing the same polite smile she'd used the first day she visited his lot. She greeted him softly, as if they were neighbors discussing garden maintenance, instead of two adversaries about to dismantle each other's lives. The chair of the hearing, a middle-aged city inspector named Grant, called the session to order. Lydia began by outlining the timeline, the altered boundary maps, the falsified permits, the destroyed property markers, her voice calm, factual, relentless. When she produced the signed architectural authorization bearing Carolyn's name, a faint stir went through the room. Grant adjusted his glasses and asked directly, "Mrs. Weaver, can you confirm this is your signature?" Carolyn didn't blink. "It is," she said smoothly, "but the document has been taken out of context. I signed it under the understanding that it was part of a general maintenance plan already approved by our association's prior consultant." Lydia's tone remained polite, but her words struck with precision. There was no prior consultant. The account used to submit these permits was traced to a P.O. box registered by your office. And according to city records, the parcel you reside on was never zoned for residential construction. The silence that followed was almost physical. Carolyn's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of something sharp passing through her eyes before she regained composure. "That information is outdated," she said, her voice firmer now, but there was a tremor beneath the words. "The association is in the process of updating all property records. I'm sure this confusion will be resolved." Grant leaned back, expression unreadable. Expression. "Then perhaps you can explain," he said slowly, "why the assessor's department lists your property as unbuilt municipal reserve land, or why your house lacks a valid address." He flipped to a photograph, a wide shot of her pristine home, submitted by Lydia as evidence. "It appears, Mrs. Weaver, that you've built a residence on land that doesn't legally belong to you." The air shifted. Even the officials who had entered the room with disinterest were suddenly attentive. Carolyn's calm fractured. "This is a personal attack," she snapped. "Mr. Gray has a history of hostility toward the association. He's fabricated these claims to avoid accountability for his own violations." Robert's voice broke through before Lydia could respond, low but unwavering. "You buried my boundary stakes under concrete and called it community improvement. You vandalized my lot to erase the evidence. You've been doing this for years, to me, to others, hiding behind rules you wrote yourself." His tone wasn't angry, but the quiet conviction in it filled the room more powerfully than any shout could have. Grant turned to the city recorder seated at the end of the table. "Please enter for the record. Confirmation of unpermitted construction at 414 Willow Bend Lane. Proceed with immediate verification." The woman nodded, typing quickly. For the first time, Carolyn seemed to lose her footing. She leaned forward, her voice rising, trying to regain control. "You don't understand," she said. "This neighborhood was falling apart before I took charge. I brought order. I kept values high. I maintained safety. She stopped when she saw the expression on Grant's face, pity mixed with exhaustion. "Mrs. Weaver," he said gently, "you built your authority on compliance, and yet you've violated the very foundation of it. This hearing isn't about community management. It's about fraud." When the decision came, it was delivered without ceremony. The city revoked her position pending investigation and issued an immediate stop order on all HOA projects associated with her signature. The property she called home was placed under review for demolition. Lydia exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders. Robert didn't move. He simply watched as Carolyn stood, pale and silent, her earlier poise crumbling into disbelief. She turned to him as if expecting some shared recognition, some acknowledgement that they had both lost something irretrievable. But Robert felt only clarity, the kind that comes when fog finally burns off after a long, oppressive storm. Outside, the rain had started to fall, soft but steady, washing the dust from the courthouse steps. Reporters weren't there. No one was filming. The world continued, indifferent. Lydia placed a hand on his shoulder and told him the rest would take time. Appeals, paperwork, recovery. But he barely heard her. The sound of rain against concrete was enough. For months, his life had been reduced to signatures, threats, and silence. Now there was movement again, something honest and unmanufactured. As he stepped into the wet air, he glanced across the street at the horizon where his lot lay hidden behind its fence. For the first time, he didn't see a battle. He saw a beginning. The weeks that followed the hearing felt strangely quiet. Robert kept expecting another letter, another sign, another unseen hand trying to claw back what had been lost. But none came. The HOA fell silent, stripped of its authority, its board members scattering like leaves after a storm. The fence around his lot was removed by city order, the asphalt cleaned and leveled, leaving behind faint scars where the concrete borders had once been. He stood there one evening at sunset, watching the light slide across the open space, and felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside him. The fight that had consumed his days and filled his nights with restless anger was over, but the echo of it lingered, a reminder of how fragile ownership could be when power hid behind civility. Carolyn's house was inspected and condemned within a month. Word spread quietly, without satisfaction or gloating. Robert didn't attend the demolition, though Lydia sent him a photo later, a pile of pale boards and a crooked chimney leaning against the sky. There was no triumph in it, only closure. What mattered wasn't her ruin, but the return of balance, however temporary. He reopened the art market that spring, smaller this time, quieter, just a handful of vendors and neighbors who still believed in what he was trying to build. The air smelled of fresh coffee again, of rain on concrete and paint drying in the sun. It wasn't celebration, but renewal, the kind that grows slowly, without applause. Sometimes he thought about the absurd chain of events, how a strip of land and a few forged signatures had nearly erased decades of his family's life. Yet he also understood something he hadn't before. The real battle was never about property. It was about the right to exist without being rewritten. He kept the bent metal stake he had once dug out from under the asphalt. It stood on his desk, rusting gently, a small monument to stubbornness and survival. And as twilight settled over the quiet lot, Robert finally felt that he had taken back not just his land, but the story that belonged to it.